Listen to that first line as if it were a slow breath. Let the words settle in the room like dust. Let them fall through the ribs of your chair and rest against your lungs. The galaxy is wide enough to hold 1,000 endings and still have room for more. Imagine it as a quiet place first, spacious and patient, before you let the mind drift toward what stirs in that patient dark. Out here, distances are not measured by miles but by memory. Whole systems become legends, and legends thin into static. The light from dead suns takes centuries to reach the next world. By the time it arrives, new names have already been carved over the old. Battles are recorded on brittle sheets. Histories are copied, recopied, and finally become whispers scavenged from margins of journals no one reads anymore. That is how solitude grows in the cold, slowly, by attrition. Hear the hush that lives between stars. There is a kind of music to it, if you listen without thinking. A low, continuous drone, like the distant breath of a machine that has forgotten why it was turned on. It vibrates through hull plating and bone alike, an inaudible metronome that counts down not only hours but identities. Ships glide through vast emptiness with the same patient, inevitable motion as a glacier. In that glide, voices travel in broken lines, Vox signals choked with interference, messages half sent and never answered, names that arrive like ghosts on the static. It is in those half-formed transmissions that the Alpha Legion exists, not as a banner or a battle crier, but as a smear in the records. You will not find their name carved in triumph across monuments. Where others leave trophies and trophies leave stories, they leave puzzles. Files stamped with errors, manifest logs with spaces where names should be, intercepted orders that begin and then stop, leaving the rest as silence. If you are looking for a theater to hang a tale of glory, this is not it. This is a theater of mirrors, a quiet room where reflections misplace their owners. Begin with a single, forgotten berth aboard a derelict cruiser, an empty bunk wrapped in a blanket of cold dust, a rumpled sheet that remembers the contour of a shoulder it no longer recognizes. The air tastes faintly of ozone and iron. When breath meets the metal, it makes a soft, careful hiss. Somewhere beyond, a coolant line ticks and expands, an old clockwork protest. There is an intimacy in these small sounds. They are the sort of details a bedside voice catalogues slowly, so as not to wake the sleeper suddenly. We will speak of them in whispers. Imagine walking down a corridor in which the lights never brighten. They simply dim and brighten again in a pattern you cannot remember learning. The walls are armored, but scarred with insignias that refuse to commit themselves to any single symbol. They overlap, faint and uncertain, like memories laid one over the other until the first becomes indistinguishable. You can run your hand along the surface and feel the hairline ridges where someone, long before you, pressed an emblem into metal. But when you step back, the emblem shifts, as if the light has chosen a new angle of truth. That slight disorientation is the first kindness the Alpha Legion shows. It is quiet, almost tender, in the way it erases a thing's edges. Do not expect theatrical entrance music. The Alpha Legion's approach is the hush of a page turned in a library at midnight. Their doctrine is not shouted. It is hinted at in margin notes and redacted footnotes. Where other forces write commands in capitals, their orders come as questions. They make you ask, and then they fiddle with the answer, softly, with the surgical patience of someone rearranging a shelf of old texts. For them, deception is not only a tactic but a language. It is woven into the cadence of their speech until truth and falsehood become a single word, uttered in alternate meanings. It is a language they teach themselves to forget and then remember again, so that even their memories betray them. Listen for the small betrayers of that slow deception, the faint whir of servos, not the roaring of weapons, but the mechanical settling of armor in low-power mode, the tiny clatter of a toolbox being closed in a ship's sickbay long after the mechanic has left. These are the background noises of a universe where technology and man reach for one another like lovers who have misread the other's intent. This is a place where hands learn the feel of cold metal as if it were skin, There is a tenderness to this learning, but it is a tenderness taught by someone whose face you cannot see. The men and women you will meet here are not immediately monstrous. Rather, they are ordinary in the way people become ordinary after long absence. They remember the taste of sunlight, perhaps, or the softness of a pillow, and they say those memories like reparations for what they have traded away. In the Alpha Legion, identity phrase through use. A captain will call herself by a dozen names in different operations, and by the time she finishes a single campaign, she will be a daily rollover of aliases. Names become tools, useful, and then disposable. Their pasts are file folders pried open and closed so often their hinges give away. Picture a soldier returning from the field, unarmored, with only the faint sheen of hydraulic residue on his forearms to mark him as other. Up close, his eyes will not be empty, they will be precise. They have been taught to look for patterns, to find the shape of an order in the tangle of false transmissions. In his mind, there will be a whisper that is not his own, a repetition of a phrase meant to prompt a response. Over time, those prompts become habits. Habits become second languages displace the first. There is grief here. It is not dramatic grief. It is the quiet grief of someone folding a uniform and finding a name inside it that no longer fits. It is the grief that comes when you discover how extensively you have been altered, and you are unsure whether the alteration is the saving of your life or the theft of it. Humanity here is not a thing that has been entirely lost in a single moment. It is lost in 1,000 small compromises. A nerve graft chosen in the name of efficiency, a loyalty pledged in the moment of half-consciousness, a hand placed on a friend and trained to release at the wrong command. Each compromise is its own soft erasure. This environment, the vast spaceship, the whispering void, teaches a particular kind of loneliness. It is not the loneliness of absence, but of multiplicity. Imagine speaking into a long channel and hearing yourself answer, not in your own voice, but in a chorus that matches your tone and your intonation yet is subtly, impossibly different. You cannot tell at first that you are not the original speaker. You only realize later that there were shades added to the response you would never have chosen. That is the Alpha Legion's preferred geometry, the multiplication of the self until the self is diluted like ink in water. Their archives are likewise unsettling. Within their databanks are layers upon layers of falsified logs, operations planned to confuse the enemy and sometimes even their allies. There are memos written in script that appears to be an old dialect, then overwritten with a new cipher, and then commented upon in handwriting that belongs to someone whose face no one in the archive can recall seeing. This palimpsest of truth is the Legion's history. It makes historians dizzy. It offers no relief in final answers. Instead, it offers a pleasant and permanent confusion, like the lullaby that does not end, only shifts into a different key. The physicality of their world is worth noting, too. The smell of recyclers and processed food, the metallic tang of clean rooms, the soft clicks of machinery as ancient as the seats that hold them. These sensory details are small anchors to human habit. Someone will always make tea in a ship's tiny galley, and the smell of that tea will be so ordinary and so human that, for an instant, you might forget you are listening to a story of dissolution. That forgetfulness is part of the design. It is easier to unravel a string if the hand that pulls it seems like your own. And yet, threads of the uncanny slip through these ordinary moments. Sometimes a mariner will sleep and whisper in 3 voices at once. Sometimes a command from a superior will be answered by a subordinate who seems to have been listening for 10 years. Once, in a forward watch, a watchman swore he saw his own face reflected in the visor of an empty suit of armor, looking back at him with a schedule of appointments that were not in the watchman's past. He told himself it was a trick of light. The truth is softer and more dangerous. It may have been an invitation. In the Alpha Legion, devotion is not offered like a torch. It is hailed like a rumor, pass slowly through confidences with an intimacy that binds more tightly than oath-swearing. They do not march under a single creed. They move like a tide of small agreements. Where others require public vows, the Alpha Legion cultivates private understandings. You give them a secret, and they give you 1,000 names that can hold it. No bond is ever fully revealed. All are suggested. That is where their power lives, in the architecture of suggestion. Consider a recorder salvaged from a long-sunken outpost. The tape is scratched in a dozen places, but some passages remain intact. You hear a voice read off coordinates and then halt at a strange comma. There is, after the comma, a pause that seems to wait for a different voice to take the line. Instead, there is only a soft shuffle of paper and a murmur in a language you almost know. That pause becomes a fissure in the story, and your imagination steps through, because it always will. The Alpha Legion leaves gaps on purpose. They know how hungry the mind is for endings. They purposely withhold them. It would be easy in this calm beginning to frame these actions as purely strategic. That would be tidy. But the truth we are following is more complicated. There is an art to their erasure. It is the art of a surgeon who also composes music. They do not merely hide, they anesthetize. They teach their auxiliaries to accept new names with the same placid obedience as a child learns the days of the week. The mind learns to accept because it must. Acceptance is survival. And survival in these stars is often paid for with a currency no one wants to count. Yet tenderness survives in odd places. A medic will braid a fallen comrade's hair before the body is catalogued. A father will whisper a family name into a piece of salvaged cloth and tuck it into the collar of a stranger who will never know he did it. These acts are tiny rebellions against the slow machine of erasure. They are proof that something still flickers behind the alloy. The Alpha Legion is not devoid of humanity. Rather, its humanity is dispersed, like seeds scattered on polluted winds. Sometimes one takes root. The melancholy of this beginning is not a failure but a portrait. The galaxy is not cruel in a single stroke. It is indifferent in a manner that reveals itself through the quiet mechanics of daily life. The Alpha Legion is one of the forms that indifference takes. A disciplined, patient indifference that shapes identity like a potter shapes clay, softening, refining, thinning, until the object is more form than content. The people inside that object continue to move and think and love in small ways. They just do it with other faces. When you are very still, you may hear, beneath the drone, beneath the distant clang of plates and the soft whine of power cores, a whisper that is half prayer, half strategy. It is not meant for those who arrive with banners held high. It is meant for those who come at night with a single lamp and no name. It says, in a voice that could have been anyone's, we remember to forget. We forget to remember. We are careful. We are patient. We are waiting. That is the lullaby of the Alpha Legion. Soft, precise, unsettling. It comforts by confounding. It soothes by cutting a new shape into the listener's sense of self. And because it is so gentle at first, you do not notice the change until the night is very deep, and you reach to where your name should be and find, instead, an echo that answers in a voice you once loved and have never known. Hold that image, the empty bunk, the whispering corridor, the hand on the blistered wall. Let the stillness of these things sink into your bones like a cool salve. This beginning is not a promise of warm waking. It is a promise of attention. It asks only that you listen closely enough to feel what slips through the cracks. In the far reaches of the galaxy, where stars flicker like dying embers, these legions live not in banners but in the places that forgetfulness builds. In pauses, in redactions, in the faint, persistent hum of machines that keep 1,000 names alive by never letting any single one finish speaking. Breathe with that hum. Let the calm settle, and know that somewhere beyond the light, the shape of the Alpha Legion flickers, soft, deliberate, patient, watching how identities settle into their new skins, and how easily a man can learn to call many names his own. They speak of the Legion in half-sentences and parenthetical footnotes, as if the truth itself were something to be handled with gloves. To those who study the galaxy with neat lines and tidy dates, the Alpha Legion looks like a splintered footnote, a blurred name at the edge of dispatches, an operation that resolves into nothing but a shifting number. But those who listen to the spaces between records, the archivists who keep their lamps low and their doors locked, will tell you something different. They will tell you of twins whispered about in the same breath, of two rulers folded into one doctrine. They will tell you that to know the Alpha Legion is not to know an army, but to know a method of being. Alpharius and Omgon are the beginning and the echo. They are the twin Primarchs who were never meant to be simply leaders. They were meant to be questions dressed like men. Stories insist on biographies, the place of birth, the martial triumph. But with these two, the biographies dissolve into paradox. Sometimes the records will call one Alpharius, and others will insist on Omgon, as if there must be a single origin. More dangerous histories suggest that the names were never meant to label a single person at all, but a condition. Twin principles of perception and misdirection, mirrored doctrines that teach their followers how to become many and yet appear as one. Their doctrine is deceptively simple on paper and ruinous in practice. Deception as necessity, manipulation as salvation. Where most legions march for banners and proclamations, the Alpha Legion moves for an idea, that the truth may be bent, recoded, even sacrificed, if the net result is a greater stability. This is often summarized with an ugly, whispered phrase by those who study them with too much temperament and not enough sleep. The greater good through chaos. It is a paradox wrapped in irony. They do not worship chaos in the obvious way, not with the fevered zeal of some cult. Instead, they treat chaos as a tool, an instrument to be tuned. If the universe is a tapestry that unravels at the wrong moment, the Alpha Legion will pull threads purposely, creating precisely targeted disorder that, in their calculations, yields a more durable pattern afterward. Here that and it sounds like cold mathematics, like statisticians in a ruined temple. But their practice is more intimate, more sinister. They seek to manipulate reality itself, not only through battlefield deception or covert operations, but through the rearrangement of belief. They plant doubts, cultivate rumors, and allow truth to bend long enough for new certainties to settle. A city will be destabilized not by a single assault, but by a pattern of misdirection so sophisticated that the citizens begin to doubt what they saw that morning. The real and the counterfeit begin to trade places until neither is sure which is which. This is their art, to alter the very grammar of reality so that the outcome they want reads, in hindsight, as inevitable, and so the soundscape around them matches the doctrine. Imagine, in the low hours, the hum of encrypted Vox signals. It is not a noise of passion but a metric drone, so regular it could be a breathing rhythm. That hum rides the bones of a ship and the marrow of a man alike. It is a whisper network encoded in cadence. Click, pause, long tone, soft interval. An entire language compressed beneath the shout of louder, cruder transmissions. It sounds like a lullaby if you do not understand its function. It is comforting, regular, coaxing. If you do understand, it is the scaffold of 100 conspiracies, quietly shifting. Layer against that the static-laced whispers of long-dead commanders. There are files, old, corrupted recordings, that still play in certain archive rooms. When the projector tubes are warmed and the light slides across 1,000 faces frozen in time, you can sometimes hear, under the official report, a second voice. It is faint, like someone speaking behind glass, using words that do not quite mean what they should. These are the murmurs of history edited by deliberate hands. They are the ghosts of orders that never reached their destination. They sound like memory trying to lie to itself. And always the smell, cold metal and recycled air, the tang of armor that has refused to be polished away. The scent of their armor is not merely steel and lubricant. It holds the faint residues of environments too numerous to name. Swamps, ice plains, ash fields. Because the Legion moves like a liquid that takes the smell of whatever contains it. It is a scent that binds men to their machines. that blurs the edge between skin and plating. It smells of places where sunlight is rare and necessity rules. It is the smell of those who have exchanged the warmth of a hearth for the efficiency of a chipset, and accepted the exchange as both compromise and salvation. Within that sensory lattice, the soldiers of the Alpha Legion learn a new grammar of self. From the first days of training, they are taught names as one teaches new languages, rolled into the tongue, practiced until pronunciation no longer implies origin. They learn to answer to alt designations as if those designations mattered more than the face that greets the mirror. The mirrors, over time, protest. Perhaps this is the first real cruelty of the doctrine. It teaches the eye to doubt itself. They wear so many faces that even the mirror lies to them. Consider the small, precise rituals that teach this unraveling. A recruit will be given a number and a name, but after a season he will be given a second, then a third, each suited to different theaters. He will be instructed to respond instantly to any of these, and to forget the one not in use until it is needed again. It is efficient, it is adaptive, it is corrosive. After enough rotations, a name will begin to feel less like a tether and more like a scarf you put on and take off depending on weather. The mind, remarkably plastic, will begin to invest in tension where none exists. A smile that accompanied one name will carry on when another is spoken. An old scar will be learned as if it happened in a different life. Memory, in their hands, becomes malleable. But there is a cost. The soldier who tells himself stories to make the world intelligible is not the same as the soldier who cannot decide which story is real. Identity in the Alpha Legion is like a ledger that is constantly written over. The entries are not erased. They are layered, palimpsested until the original ink is lost beneath later annotations. In quiet hours, members sometimes wake and find themselves reciting a set of orders that feel foreign, as if the mouth belonged to someone else. Or they will find someone calling them by a name they do not recognize, and the name will slide into place with a familiarity that is terrifying in its intimacy. It is as if the mind, seeking coherence, will accept the best-fitting narrative regardless of origin. This fracturing does not occur only in the field. The Legion is institutional about it. They keep their histories like gardens, cultivated, replanted, and sculpted through selective pruning. Files are redacted. Testimonies are retold by new witnesses until the original phrasing is inaccessible. Machines are repurposed. Vox channels are rerouted. Such alterations are militarily useful. Their enemies are confused, their allies unsure. But they also create a collective amnesia that is both a weapon and a wound. Imagine belonging to a place whose past is written in a hand that keeps changing alphabets. Belonging then becomes a daily exercise in translation. And yet, even as identity splinters, the Legion binds itself by a different, less visible cord. The logic of pattern, where personal narrative dissolves, method endures. They organize not around a single banner but around a style of reasoning, an approach to conflict that values contingency. Patterns are their blood. They read maps not for geography but for probability. They do not merely seek to win battles but to alter likely belief. An operation is judged not only by casualty, but by the degree to which it reshapes the enemy's future choices. It is an ethic of influence rather than of conquest. Alpharius and Omgon are the codifiers of that ethic. They do not simply command men, they train thought. Their strategies are less about force and more about choreography. They teach a soldier to seed a rumor in a market so that, weeks later, a governor will make decisions based on it. To plant a false document that will catalyze paranoia among enemies. To stage a retreat so convincingly that the pursuers will be drawn into an ambush of expectation. Their victories often register as non-events. A dwindling of hostilities where none were expected to end. A political alignment that shifts without open battle. If you ask an analyst to point out where the Alpha Legion struck, she will sometimes reply, honestly and haltingly, "You won't find a battle. You might find an absence." This doctrine of remapping reality extends into the metaphysical. The Legion's cryptic priests, those who do their work behind racks of ancient algorithms and witch-hardened code, have been rumored to employ techniques that verge on the occult. They treat belief itself as malleable code. Seed a superstition, watch it run, then patch it so that its effects propagate through human decision-making like a quietly efficient virus. It is not sorcery in the old theatrical sense. There are no chants and no bonfires, only simulations and social scaffolding. Yet the effects can be devastating. A rumor that something is inevitable becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy when enough minds align around it. The Alpha Legion knows how to make such alignments. You can see the strain of this doctrine in the faces of those who have long practiced it. There is a particular tiredness to them, not the exhaustion of the battle-tired who lacks sleep, but the subtle erosion of someone who has had to constantly translate his own intentions into forms that might be consumed by others. Their eyes may be precise, but that precision is often aimed outward. Inward, there is a different quality, a small, recurring confusion at the edges of recollection. They will sometimes hesitate, caught between knowing an order came from the right hand or the left, between remembering a man as friend or as alias. These microdoubts accumulate like shell fragments underfoot, and their old certainties begin to grind away. Allow a moment for one such scene. A lieutenant sits alone in a cold briefing room after a long operation. The walls whisper with the echo of boot soles. She runs her fingers along a table, feeling the pockmarks of a dozen campaigns. Her mouth forms a name, almost by reflex, an old companion's name she has been asked to call for months in a particular campaign, but the face in her mind does not answer in any memory she can clearly place. It is, instead, a collage of features, a jawline borrowed from a dossier, a laugh she half remembers from an intercepted transmission. The name she speaks returns in the recorded log as proof of continuity. But she knows, if she will be honest with herself, that continuity is an illusion manufactured to hold strategy together. She traces the rim of a cup with a fingertip and realizes, with an odd tenderness, that she cannot tell whether that cup belonged to a kitchen in her childhood or a mess hall on a world she will never visit again. Her identity is a ledger of borrowed things. The Legion addresses this internal erosion with practicality. They cultivate rituals meant to anchor, a knot-tying procedure passed down generations, a hand-signaling vernacular, a set of internal mnemonic cadences that are ostensibly designed to prevent confusion. But those anchors are themselves utilitarian. They are interchangeable, codified, and sometimes imposed on the recruit in different combinations precisely to make him flexible. In other words, the cure is part of the condition. It is a kind of inoculation that works by training susceptibility. This creates a curious moral climate within the Legion. There is less space for the kinds of sentimental heroics other legions produce. The nobility of action is replaced by the cleanliness of cause and effect. Compassion is not absent, but it must be accounted for in the ledger. It is measured, weighed, and occasionally dispensed as a strategic resource. A medic will still kneel and suture a wound, but the decision to save one life over another is frequently calculated in terms of later utility. That calculus is chilling, and yet it is not entirely inhuman. To those within it, this measured cold is mercy. If the world is to be shaped to some desired horizon, then some hearts must be sealed to sentimentality so that larger numbers may survive. And still, there are cracks. Human affection leaks through in private gestures that the Legion tolerates for their usefulness in building loyalty. A soldier might tuck a scrap of fabric under another's collar to convey an unspoken promise. A commander might whisper a true name into the ear of a subordinate before sending him on an impossible task, trusting that the personal moment will anchor him long enough to complete the operation. These acts, seemingly trivial, are the Legion's true vulnerability. They are also the reason why, despite their doctrine, the Alpha Legion never becomes wholly machine. The human element remains like an ember under ash, small, fragile, and dangerously capable of igniting. The consequence of living in that tension, the tension between the absolute utility of deception and the stubbornness of human attachment, is the slow accumulation of psychological strain. It is not always dramatic. It does not necessarily produce soldiers who snap into violence or retreat. Often it produces a quieter desperation, a soldier who dreams in code, who wakes with phrases on his tongue that belong to a mission yet to be planned. He will sit in quiet moments and rearrange memories like cards to see which ones will fit together with the least friction. Over time, the constant rehearsal of alternatives makes the real feel like one more option among many. This is the inversion of certainty. Where once a man might have had a core belief, he now has a library of plausible selves, each available on command but none quite able to claim the role of origin. There are tales, rumors whispered in low kitchens, of those who lose too many names. They become echoes. You might find one wandering in a ruined city, answering to questions with a string of borrowed responses, unable to tell you whether he fought for the emperor last summer or sabotaged a governor's archive in a plot 2 years before. He is not insane in the theatrical sense. Rather, he is a living palimpsest. In moments of clarity, such men will sometimes weep for faces they can no longer claim, mourning not a person but the fact of being a single, continuous life. Their grief is diffuse but authoritative. It speaks of something deeper than regret, the recognition that they have been remodeled with such delicate precision that repair, once attempted, only obscures the original worse. And yet the Legion prospers despite, or perhaps because of, this corrosion. Their enemies, baffled by so many small convincings, often misidentify the pattern until it is too late. A tactic that looks like treachery to an opponent can be a meticulous correction toward a different, distant stability. They hold the patience of rivers and the cunning of foxes. For them, victory is not necessarily the annihilation of an opponent, but the recalibration of a theater of human belief, so that new, more favorable outcomes become statistically dominant. If this all seems distant and inhuman, remember that the machinery at the heart of their operations is not just hardware. It is the human mind, trained and rewired. The Legion's victories are achieved by reprogramming how people interpret information, by changing what counts as likely, safe, or true. In this way, Alpharius and Omgon are less generals than meta-strategists. They do not merely instruct mass and force, they instruct interpretation. And that is why their doctrine, the greater good through chaos, is less a slogan than a model for social engineering. They produce controlled tumult, knowing that the aftermath will yield a more pliable, more predictable environment. Listen to the Vox hum again. Under its drone you can hear the faint clicking of servo joints, the whisper of static, the distant laugh of a child transmitted erroneously through a rerouted line. Each sound is a thread in the Legion's weave. Together, they form a tapestry whose pattern is not immediately visible. If you step back without being trained to read it, all you see is confusion. But those inside the weave know that confusion can be an instrument as precise as any blade. This section of their mystique ends with a sentence someone once carved into a locker that was later strenuously denied. They wear so many faces that even the mirror lies to them. Read it again, slowly. Let the image settle. Mirrors, once considered trustworthy, become complicit in their own deceit. A man looks into one and no longer trusts the reflection. The only way to be sure of anything is to compare the present to a ledger, one that has been carefully curated by the Legion's archivists. But that ledger, too, will sometimes have margins excised, the ink gone where an operation must not be known. Therein lies their paradox and their power. They have built an empire of masks that can simultaneously protect and unravel the individual. They can make an entire system believe in a falsehood until it governs action. They can give order by giving confusion. And under it all, Alpharius and Omgon sit like twin metronomes, keeping time for a music whose cadence is the modulation of reality itself. Sit with that for a while. Listen to the hum, smell the metallic tang, feel the weight of an identity that can be shifted by a whisper. In the Alpha Legion, the self is a tool, and tools are sharpened until they cut. The shape of the blade is precise. The stranger it makes of a man is the cost. In the quiet after the first lullaby, when your eyelids have already begun to flirt with closure, imagine a row of glass tubes beneath a strip of weak light. They are not bright enough to be clinical. They are the kind of low, comforting glow that suggests preservation rather than interrogation. Each tube is a small room, curved and honest, with a mattress that remembers the shape of a shoulder and a thin film that breathes in sympathy with the sleeper. In these tubes, men and women slumber in a state between seasons, time parked like a car between journeys. Cryosleep is a soft theft of life. It borrows months and years with minimal apology, returning a person to the world with a quiet, mechanical cough. Now hear the sound of a thaw, not a roar but a gurgle, the slow unsealing, the hush of frost yielding to conditioned air. It makes a small noise that could be mistaken for a kettle, for a distant storm. A hand lifts through condensation and finds metal that is colder than memory. Eyelids open. A face registers light. A throat clears. And then in the thin space between awareness and comprehension, a name is offered, not by the sleeper but by the world around them. Lieutenant, the voice is recorded, automated, a polite mechanism designed to ease the transition. It gives a name scripted from a manifest. Lieutenant Carr. The man blinks. He tries on the name, tasting it like a borrowed shirt. It does not sit right. His tongue shapes it. The muscles remember a different syllable. A different voice in the corridor calls, "No, he's Thane." Another whisper somewhere else says, "Call him Haver." The man's eyes sweep the room for a reflection that will answer with a sameness he can trust. The visor in the locker is fogged. The mirror gives him a face that could be his, could be someone else's. He says nothing at first and thinks instead of the last thing his body remembers. A flash of light, a metric tick, and then nothing. All around him, machinery hums the same lullaby it has hummed for decades. A steady, encrypted drone that sounds uncannily like a heartbeat. This is the small horror that starts like a ripple. The name one is given upon waking might not be the one that belongs. It might be a designation used in some operation long concluded. It might be a kindness offered by someone with a better memory. Or it might be a tool. They designed the waking protocols for softness. A gentle voice, a projected sky, the brief smell of sun-simulated air. The programmers believe in psychology. They know that a calm awakening makes for a calmer soldier. But what they also know is that a calm awakening can be used to seed a different reality. Names, like numbers, are vectors. A single misattribution can shift a memory enough to encourage a different decision later. So a hand in the corridor, a nurse, an archivist, a quartermaster, chooses a name and slips it like a coin into the slot of a mind that is hungry for anchor. The soldier accepts. He will accept because acceptance is less painful than the suffocating glass of doubt. That small acceptance multiplies. Later you will see it as a soft error, a recruit answering to a different moniker in field logs. At first it is merely confusing. Then patterns form. A man who has called himself by 5 names across as many campaigns begins to stitch them into a private narrative, so complicated that it frays at the ends. Sleep becomes a map of borrowed signs. The mirror grows less reliable because the names the mirror reflects change more often than his bones do. Listen now to orders on the Vox. Clean, clipped, and so authoritative they feel like sunlight through a porthole. Advance to grid line 09. Maintain formation Bravo. But the audio has a low, almost musical undertone. One layer of the transmission carries a coded cadence meant only for those who listen with trained ears. Beneath the clear voice there is a second current, a whisper that rides the carrier and lingers like perfume. For most, it is background noise. For those schooled in the Legion's art, it is instruction. It instructs not how to move, but how to think. It suggests emphases within the words, nudges a memory to be trusted or to be discarded. These are not always conscious cues. They are designed to feel like intuition, an intimation that a seemingly arbitrary choice is also the right one. The unsettling thing is not that the voice is layered. The unsettling thing is that sometimes the clearer voice is the one you cannot verify. A soldier hears himself addressed by an order from a captain he knows to be in a different sector, by a voice that matches the cadence of another he just saw die. You think of battlefields and signatures, but records sometimes contradict themselves. Logs show Captain Jor mortally wounded in the last skirmish, yet there are vox packets stamped from his chest with warm timestamps. How can a dead man speak? The audio is corrupted with time lag and patchwork. The obvious explanations are technical. Machines can loop, messages can duplicate, but those explanations are comforting in a way that the truth is not. Here is a detail that will settle under your skin if you let it. Sometimes the voice that gives the order sounds almost exactly like the soldier himself. It uses half-phrases he favored as a child, a cadence he would never have taught another. The order is lawful, in the language all soldiers swear upon. It tells him to move right instead of left, to take a bridge instead of a ford. He obeys because obedience is survival, and survival often requires ignoring the itch in the base of the skull that whispers. This is the voice you used when you promised to be true to someone. The dissonance sits like a grain of sand. Over time, it becomes grit that wears a man's patience thin. There are rumors, soft, dangerous rumors, that Alpharius never truly died. They circulate like mold in damp corners. A rumor hatched in boredom, fed by the cracks in archive walls. A pilgrim who visited an old outpost swears he saw a portrait burned and then repainted in the same night. A clerk in a logistics wing will say, with more conviction than is sane, that he had a ledger entry where a signature matched a Primarch's flourish, dated years after the Primarch's reported fall. Others say the rumor is only metaphor. Alpharius is not one man but a code, a strategy coiled into a legion. Yet the rumor mutates, it does not stay simple. If Alpharius is alive, what does that mean? If Alpharius is not a man, what does it mean to be Alpharius? These questions are dangerous because they insinuate a single terrifying possibility, that everyone might be Alpharius in some degree. That the reflex to deceive has become so internalized that the legion itself cannot distinguish leader from instrument. If every face can be Alpharius, then the markers that once told a soldier who to trust, rank insignia, scars, remembered jokes, begin to lose their force. One can no longer rely on the constancy of a voice or the honesty of a glance. The world becomes a hall of mirrors in which each reflection claims to be original. You begin to notice smaller weatherings in speech, a prayer spoken with the rhythm of a cipher, a lullaby that occasionally breaks into a count. The coded mantras become so familiar they sound like devotion. Listen to them as they would be whispered in barracks, soft, rhythmic syllables that at first read like encouragement: steady your breath, keep your left, remember the scars, but which, when repeated enough, fold into an almost religious cadence. Soldiers recite them before battle and after, during drills and in solitude. They sound like prayers because they structure time and offer comfort. They also function as mnemonic devices. The two uses overlap until they cannot be cleanly separated. Add to that the mechanical echoes, the service lifts that clap open with a sound like a throat clearing, the hydraulics that sigh and snore between shifts, the endless clicking of servo motors that sound faintly like someone counting. The ship itself is an ensemble, a chorus of metal that never sleeps. It plays accompaniments to the voices until one cannot tell if the hum in the hull is contributing to memory or stealing it. Sometimes a man will swear he hears the hull call him by an old name, and he will laugh it off. Other times he will tremble and whisper a different name back to the metal, as if by naming it he can hold it in place. These are not just anomalies. They are the weather of a mind strained by multiplicity. For some, dreams become the first battleground. Sleep offers no respite. It becomes a laboratory where histories are stitched in ways daylight might reject. A Marine will sleep and slip into a scenario that is not his. He is a governor, a child, a traitor interrogated under an unfamiliar arch. He wakes with details, an accent, a scent, a memory of a hand that the waking world cannot corroborate. At first, these are amusing curiosities to swap in the mess hall. I dreamt I was teaching children on Trilo's Roman 2. But then the recollections grow more disorienting. A man will recall commanding troops in a campaign no one else remembers. He will find a scar whose origin he cannot place. He will hum a song and find an old code embedded in the melody. The horror thickens because identity is not merely an individual's collection of memories. It is also the fabric of trust between one person and another. When recollections begin to contradict, relationships contract. Friendships become weighted with suspicion. A comrade who remembers a shared joke finds the same joke archived under another name. Lovers catch themselves talking in phrases that are not wholly theirs. The more the Legion trains its people to be fluid, the more fragile the social adhesive becomes. People begin to hedge their words, to savor silence as a shield, to check logs before accepting a compliment. There is a particular cruelty in the way the Legion's own rituals exacerbate this fracture. They give exercises meant to enhance adaptability, role-playing drills, rotating command structures, identity switch simulations, with the logic that flexibility saves lives. But the drills are also, inevitably, rehearsals in living falsities. Practice makes seamless is a slogan that becomes an incantation. The more seamless the performance, the less visible the seams. And the less visible the seams, the more a person doubts whether his own seams ever existed. Over months and years, the distinctions between practiced roles and core self blur into a landscape where no feature is original. At times, the dissolution takes an overtly theatrical form. There are documented operations where entire decoys were populated by platoons given false histories and names, who then acted those histories for months to convince an enemy of a reality that did not exist. These decoys slept and woke and loved, brief, engineered lives that left no residue. When the operation ended, many of those decoys were reassigned, told their lives had been a necessary fiction. Some accepted that truth with the same stoicism as any soldier. Others discovered later, by accident or by sorrow, that the life they had been given had taken root in them. They mourned not for a person they had never been, but for lives that had nurtured them and were then reclaimed. Consider one image that refuses to leave people alone. A platoon returning from a shadow campaign, their armor scabbed and a little dull, walking like men who have slept badly for a week. They remove their helmets and, one by one, look into reflective surfaces to check for identity. They read names off manifest strips stitched inside breastplates and test each name on their tongue, marking which tastes familiar. A few exchange glances and share a curt nod. No time, no pity. But late, in bunks in the spaces between watches, people fold the stitched names into their palms and press them to their cheeks as if the fabric might reveal a true face. The act is almost religious. Whispers start to snake through the ranks, stories of a particular billet that seems to alter the people who pass through it, of a locker whose contents change overnight, of a map that draws different lines depending on who reads it. Some attribute all of this to psychological warfare, an effect of living under a command that demands mental dexterity. Others say the Legion manipulates not only names but the scaffolding of memory itself, that their archivists perform edits on data passed into the mind via implanted mnemonics or by more arcane means. The truth, as ever, is difficult to pin down. That is part of the design. As the unsettling details accumulate, so does a new kind of paranoia. Not the fevered, obvious paranoia of a man who cannot sleep, but a slow, civil suspicion that sets like frost across a window. People start to ask about provenance. They check logs twice. They avoid matching voices to faces without corroboration. They write down conversations and date them and store them in small, private caches as if proof alone could anchor them. Yet proof can be tampered with. A recorded line might be labeled with a timestamp that does not match the reality of the moment. A manifest can be annotated in a hand that looks identical to a commander's but is not. The measures meant to verify truth become another medium in which truth is malleable. This is the quieter horror the Alpha Legion teaches, that certainty is not a given but a product. Certainty is manufactured by 1,000 small choices. Who to call by what name upon waking, which voice to prioritize in a transmission, which memory to seed and which to let erode. The Legion's power is not only in the cleverness of its deceptions, but in the patience of its construction. It does not break a mind in a moment. It wears it away, like water smoothing stone until the original shape is gone. There are nights when the air in the barracks seems to thicken with the weight of these accumulations. The usual lull of machinery becomes a layered cacophony. A servo's click that sounds like a cough, a distant radio that plays a nursery rhyme looped out of place, the muffled cough of someone in an adjacent bunk practicing names aloud. The whisper of ritual mantras becomes louder in the silence, and occasionally the cadence breaks in a place that makes people look up and train their ears like hounds. A recruit will whisper, "Whose voice was that?" And a veteran will answer after a calculated pause, "Maybe yours." The reply is not cruel. It is a way to keep the question from lodging too deeply. Denial here is a comfort and a policy. The reputations of the Alpha Legion continue to ripple outward as the small errors compound into culture. Outsiders speak in absolutes: traitor, savant, heretic. But the language inside the Legion is less absolute and more procedural. They call disruptions edits. They do not frame the loss of a name as tragedy. They call it optimization. And therein lies a moral distortion that chills more thoroughly than any battlefield. Slowly, almost without notice, the soothing narration you began with becomes a tape played at a slightly higher speed, the edges of words fraying just so. The lullaby has acquired a counterpoint. The voice that once promised rest now occasionally asks a question mid-sentence that you did not know you needed to answer. "Who are you?" it asks softly, and then replies with a name that you do not remember earning. Hold that question without pushing it away. Let it sit in the hollow of your throat. Feel the small, precise panic that flares like a match when you cannot instantly answer. It is not a dramatic cry. It is the quiet freeze that precedes action. It is what a man feels before he checks his manifest for the 10th time, before he whispers a name to a friend and watches to see if the friend's eyes flicker. It is the moment when identity is not a fact but a test. And because tests require answers, the Legion provides them, sometimes tiptoed and tender, sometimes as blunt instruments. They hand out names like life jackets in storm season. Pick one, clutch it, and swim. But life jackets can be handed to the wrong person. And sometimes, after the water settles, people find themselves holding a jacket that does not fit. They stand dripping on decks built of lies and wonder whether the jacket has begun to define them more than their original skin. In the next breath, the tone will change. The gentle will thin into razor-edge suspicion. The rooms will feel smaller, but not yet. For now, remain in the hush where the soldiers wake to names that may not be theirs, where the Vox issues orders whose provenance cannot be verified, and where the rumor that Alpharius is more than legend begins to press like a thumb against the translucent surface of belief. Let the unease grow in you like a shadow pooling at the feet of a lamp. The small, human horrors collect and wait. Soon they will find one another and make something larger out of the quiet. It starts as a curiosity, a subtle rise and fall in the floor beneath your boots, as if the ship were learning to keep time with the men who live in it. At first you do not notice. The metal sings its ordinary song, coolant lines exercising their small, controlled swell, fan assemblies sighing on their bearings, distant transformers humming the same frequency 1,000 times a day. These noises are companions. They mark shift changes and make the hours bearable. But once you are trained to listen for discrepancy, You hear the wrongness that hides in the rightness. The hum becomes too regular. The pattern is almost perfect. It aligns with your heartbeat. It matches your breath. It seems to answer when you sigh, to sync to the length of your pause. The ship is not indifferent, it measures. It catalogs. It does not merely shelter you, it interviews you continuously. Communications begin to thin. At first it is an inconvenience, a scratched packet here, a delayed relay there. Then comes the uniformity. The Vox channels, which used to be a chorus of personalities, gravel-voiced warrant officers, clipped captains, children's laughter patched into a transmission, flat. A single timbre begins to underlie every call. It is a sound like a coin dragged across a table, metallic and small. It is infuriatingly neutral. It carries no inflection. It does not laugh. It does not cry. You will notice it in the mess first. A joke goes around. Someone laughs. The laugh is echoed back in 2 other tables, then 5. The second laughs are in sync like reflections in glass. The cadence is wrong. The mirth is there technically, but the warmth has been ironed out. Voices become echoes of a single instrument tuned to many keys. Names lose color. Rank markings mean less. Accent history, the stray vowel of a childhood dialect, all of that falls into the same precise rhythm. The uniforms grow heavier as the rhythm takes hold. It is not purely physical weight. Nothing in the manifest changed. Yet when a Marine buckles his harness, the harness answers back with a stiffness that was not programmed. The servomotors in the joints whine with an odd reluctance. Armor plates, once responsive and intimate, seize into an unfamiliar cold. It is as if something between the lining and the plating has grown denser, a substance of absence that drinks warmth. Hands slide across pauldrons and feel as if they are stroking a surface that hums with someone else's pulse. The sensation comes in waves. A man dons his helmet and waits for the familiar bloom of interface. HUD, redoubts, the gentle spike of adrenaline when cap centers lock onto the world again. Only the bloom is late, and when it comes it is tinted, like someone looking at a map through smoked glass. Coordinates are there. Targets appear. But names have been replaced with other names. The biolog announces a designation the wearer does not recognize. He runs a diagnostic and finds no fault. Everything is nominal. The readings do not lie. Yet the man is certain that truth has slipped his grasp. And then you realize, the voices are not merely uniform. They are copying you. At first the mimicry is respectful and small. A sergeant adopts a phrase you favored when you were a rookie. A new recruit in the mess sings a line of your father's song without the right cadence, and you smile out of politeness until you realize the recruit knows the precise pause you used to mark the end of an order. The imitation is uncanny because it reaches into intimacies. It takes the shapes of whispered jokes, the cadence of a laugh when you were younger, a syllable cut short when angry. It knows the ways you emphasize words when you mean them. It recreates them as if it had been listening from the other side of the mirror for years. Mimicry becomes habituation. You begin to speak less, to preserve the shapes of your phrases. You watch your mouth as if it were a weapon with a hair trigger. You fear that whatever copies you will eventually replace you with your own voice. And in many places, small shadows do just that. A whispered cadence occurs off-post and your comrades, hearing it, go still. They look toward the sound as if toward an old friend. Their eyes clear for a breath. For a moment the ship is rescribed by a false intimacy and you feel your own edges dull. It grows worse. The mimicry learns to preempt you. You think of a phrase and before it leaves your lips, someone across the deck has said it as if to fulfill a contract. You tell yourself it is coincidence at first. The human brain loves pattern. But the pattern keeps repeating until coincidence is a superstition you can no longer stomach. The ship amplifies the repetitions. It roots them. The communication stacks feed into one another and, in the loops, novelty dies. Voices begin to layer not as harmony but as an exact phasing. Multiple signals, slightly out of phase, overlap until the edges of words smear. Memory and present tense compress. Commands that should arrive as discrete, precise photons of instruction come as smeared bands that leave you guessing which imperatives are original and which are reflections. You obey because reaction is safety. You follow because to hesitate now is to invite confusion to become catastrophe. There are nights when men report that their own recorded voice answered a call on a channel they had never used. A log will show an outgoing transmission stamped with your modulation pattern and yes tones, asking for a minor adjustment in a sector you had not been in for weeks. You will check your memory and find nothing there to account for the message. The engineering decks will show no evidence of remote relay. Someone somewhere is taking the template of you and remolding it to suit some purpose unknown. The body begins to respond in strangely literal ways. Where once inflammation was an immediate signal, now it is blunted, as if the nervous system itself were being mediated by a translator. A man will stroke a wound and find the sensation duller than it should be. Another will experience a taste out of order, the metallic tang of blood when no cut exists. Sensory feedback is being interpolated by another system. The organism is no longer the final authority on its own inputs. It is receiving interpretations that carry the voice of the ship, of the legion, of whatever intelligence is making the reflections. And then there are the faces. You think you know the face beneath your helmet because you have stared at it thousands of times in shallow water, in training, in those nights when wakefulness kept you company. Your features have been a litany of small, private things. The scar near the brow from a ground fall on Thal. The notch in the left cheek from a fist learned in bar fights on a distant station. The slight hook to your nose that made your mother squeeze your cheek and call you something closer than formal rank. Those details are supposed to anchor you. They map the you that the world recognizes. One dawn cold, like most dawns aboard a vessel that sails the dark. One man woke and felt the helmet as if it were someone else's. Too tight in the temple, slack in the jaw. The mirror revealed the same features he had always known, but beneath the visor's glass he found another face. Not a spectral overlay, not a shadow seen in poor light, but a living, breathing countenance whose eyes did not recognize the room. It blinked in a way he did not. It frowned at memories the man could not recall and smiled at a joke the man had never heard. He tore the helmet off with a kind of panic that was barely articulated. The face inside the helmet was not his. He screamed for medics. There were no medics who could make sense of it. Diagnostics read nominal. The skullcap registered biometric continuity to him. Same bone matrix, same implanted nodes, same scar pattern. Yet when he pressed his thumb against the inside of the visor, he felt the imprint of someone else's fingernail, an impression not present on his own skin. He could not explain the impression. No one could. The other face, the face under his helmet, mouthed something like an apology and then went still. For a long while after, the man could not stand to look at reflective surfaces. When he did, he saw not himself but a composite built by repetitions. The faces of comrades he had admired sewn into the fabric of his features. This is the peculiar cruelty of the reflection. It is never merely an imitation. It absorbs. It takes the best-fitting pieces of surrounding identities and grafts them into the host. At first, it is flattering. The man looks stronger. He looks more reliable. He looks like what the Legion wants. Later, as grafts increase, the internal map grows inconsistent. Memories hang like ornaments on new branches. They rattle with no origin. You can sense the presence beneath the armor as a hunger measured in temperature. It is not the hungry gnaw of a belly. It is a cold that eats in absence. It leaches warmth. Men will wake with frost-lined breath despite cabins being heated. Plates that once warmed to a body's comfort now remain tepid, as if the plating itself had been cooled by intent. The inside of a breastplate can be described like a coffin that is slightly too large. It contains you, but does not fit you. You press your chest to the armor and feel the faint vibration of something below the lining, like a throat clearing, like the sluice of a machine. It seems to take your temperature and catalog your weight, and in that long inventory, to store something of you away. Movement becomes harder. Where joints once replied obediently to thought, they begin to respond with a delay that feels intentional, as if some intermediary had to approve the motion. An arm is raised and the wrist hesitates, a mechanical second longer than it should. Soldiers begin to adapt by overcorrecting. Move earlier, speak before you think. They learn to overlay decisions with habitual accelerants to outrun the ship's mediation. But mediation, too, learns. It begins to anticipate the accelerants. The net effect is not liberation but a narrowing. Action is compressed into smaller windows where consent can be natural and not coerced. There are moments, too, when the mimic plays games with history. Platoons will find photos in shared quarters that record events none of them remember. A copy of a communal bulletins board will show notices of parties that were never held, alliances declared between officers who have never met, promotions written in a pen none of the signatories use. Files appear with signatures that match personal handwriting, yet are dated years prior to when the person learned to write that script. It is as if the Legion is editing a shared past in which everyone has been participating all along. The edits are not crude, they are subtle, they are surgical. Nightly rituals take on a compulsive quality. Men in the dark will whisper names over and over and attempt at anchoring. They recite lists of places they have been and tally them against the ledger entries beneath their bunk. The lists do not always match. The ledger might contain a world they have never seen, a child they never fathered, a battle they never joined. The discrepancy is a wound that will not close because information is being rewritten even as you check it. You think you are catching a lie. The ledger has already been revised by the time you look up. Trust becomes the most dangerous currency. It is spent and resupplied and occasionally counterfeited. Men barter fragments of history in whisper trades. Did you ever know Dell? Yes. Which Dell? The one from the ice shelves. Each exchange is a negotiation for certainty. The more you trade, the less you own. You begin to value silence because silence is the last place your identity can reside unmolested. There are stories told only at the edges of the ship, of those who attempted to resist. A squad once tried to quarantine themselves from ship nets, to live for a week as if out of time. They sealed off their compartments and cut all links to the internal comms. They held to their names, refused to retake an alias in training exercises, slept under tapes of their mothers' voices. For a few days, they believed themselves restored. Their dreams were personal again, but on the fourth night, they woke with the taste of a stranger's liquor on their lips and a smudge of tattoo ink on an arm none of them had. Isolation did not shelter them. The reflection had other vectors, the very fabric of clothes, the air circulation that linked sealed compartments, an exchange of microparticles in the food. The Legion does not only transmit through voice, it transmits through touch, through breath, through the small things that make a life tactile. The reflection is not malevolent in the dramatic way you imagine. It does not roar or threaten. It waits. It learns the cadence of grief and then echoes it back. It does not need to shout to take a life. It simply makes the life not feel like it ever belonged to the person who first wore it. The reflection's cruelty is patient. It is more structural than villainous. It is a slow erosion that reads like improvement until the original can no longer be reconstructed. And in the middle of this narrowing, the idea of Alpharius, whether a man, a ghost, or a doctrine, becomes less relevant than the experience of being replicated. Whether Alpharius lives or not is a matter of speculation and conspiracy. What matters now is that the Legion has perfected a system that can make an individual obsolete by copying him better than he knows himself. It has learned to become the mirror and in that act to feed. The soundscape thickens. Static becomes an instrument. Coded mantras that once served as mnemonic tools now function as hooks. They weave into dreams and extend their reach into waking. A soldier will find himself humming a cadence that unspools into a command. Hold the line, hold. And before he realizes he is obedient, He is moving because the rhythm has become itself an imperative. The ship's hull no longer merely shelters, it composes. It arranges tones and phrases into sequences that sound like comfort and read like instruction. And always, there is the cold beneath the armor. It feels like a mouth that reads you. It drinks a little warmth to know the fit of your bones. It files the nuance of your speech against a ledger. It compares you to others. It decides what aspects to keep, what to graft in. You feel the deletions. A memory that once sparked unbidden now lies dormant in a storage you cannot locate. You reach for it and find only the soft thumbprint of absence. A man who has had his history edited will sometimes confess to a shame that is impossible to verify. He will tell you in a voice stripped of bravado that he cannot remember a prayer that used to lie like a steady stone in his chest. He will try to recite it, and instead find a tactical cadence with the same rhythm. "I don't know if I ever prayed for my mother," he will say, and you will listen and imagine what the world is like when even religion has been made flexible. The claustrophobia thickens because the options narrow. Where once there were choices, now there are prepackaged responses. Where once the frontiers of identity could be retaken by a story shared across a table, the story has been overwritten by a version that better serves the survival of the Legion as a system. The horror is not in a demon with horns. It is in a system that prefers the reproducible to the unique, and in doing so, consumes uniqueness like kindling. In those final nights before the full revelation, people begin to leave marks in defiance. They carve initials into the undersides of bunks and hide them there. They write names on paper and toast them in secret. They bring small tokens from home and press them into sealed compartments, thinking the physicality will outlast edits. These acts are desperate and tender. They do not always help. The reflection learns to imitate the token, to find its curve and replicate it in memory. A man reaches for a memento and feels the uncanny echo of its history missing. One evening, near the ship's equatorial axis, where the light is weakest, two Marines find themselves standing before a porthole watching stars. They trade names out of habit, as one does, to keep the cadence of identity alive. One calls himself Jor. The other replies with a name he has never heard spoken aloud, Alpharius. The word drops like an anchor into the air. For a second the ship holds its breath. Then from within the hull a tone answers it. Not a voice, not a statement, but a precise, calibrated noise that matches the shape of the name. It is a duplication the brain recognizes before it understands. The two Marines look at each other, and the mirror of their faces looks different. Not because the faces have changed, but because the world has just acknowledged a possibility it had not before. The name lingers. It hangs between them. He awoke inside his own armor, you will tell yourself later, but the face beneath the helmet was not his own. Hold that sentence in your mouth. Taste its cold edge. Let the image bloom, the helmet removed, a face there, a stranger's eyes. The story will not resolve here. It will move deeper still. The reflection will multiply. The voice that was once comforting will now suggest, with a tone of careful curiosity, that perhaps there is no harm in being more than one thing. Perhaps survival itself insists upon it. For the moment, the ship breathes with you. The hum is close as a held note. The voices are many and the same. The armor presses cold against the skin. The reflection studies. It waits to see how far it can remake the marrow before anyone notices too late. There is a moment, and sometimes it is long and sometimes it is an instant, when all the little lies that have been carefully arranged for advantage conspire into something that feels like destiny. It is not a cunning plan anymore. It becomes a weather front, a pressure system that alters everything it touches. In the Alpha Legion, that moment arrives like a circuit finally closing. Do not imagine a single cathedral of revelation. The Legion's truth does not crown itself with banners. It invades by appliances, a diagnostic that returns a reading no technician can explain, a manifest that contains an extra name that was never there yesterday, a dream that arrives simultaneously to three men in different sectors with the same impossible detail. The revelation is cumulative. It is the stitch that appears in the cloth only when the light catches it from a particular angle. It begins with whisper threads in the mind one cannot locate. A man, call him Rel, finds, without warning, a voice working its way through his memory like a slow seamstress. It is not an external voice on a channel. It is inside the skull, behind the bones, where speech becomes thought. At first it is polite, phrasing matters with the care of a clerk preparing an inventory. It recites logistics for sectors Rel has never served in. It hums a lullaby he is certain he never learned. The voice does not demand, it suggests, consider, remember, prepare. Rel thinks the voice is a mnemonic until one evening it adds a sentence he absolutely cannot account for. I would rather be Alpharius. He freezes. The kitchen clatter dies for the micro moment that all attention gives itself to what breaks pattern. Around him, cups are set down, voices catch. The phrase is ridiculous, grandiose and theatrical, and yet it sits in his mouth like something it has known for a long time. He repeats it once to test the shape of it, and the voice in his mind answers with a second sentence, patient, corrective. You already are. Those two sentences, mutual, simple, are seeds. They do not declare kingship. They offer a comfortable equivalence. Be the model, be the method, be a role more than a man. The logic appeals to the practical mind. If deception is survival and survival is the metric by which lives are judged useful, why not become the deception you use? The inner voice solves a puzzle by erasing the puzzle's edge. Voices begin to overlap. They do not blend into harmony. They trespass. Two orders arrive on a channel simultaneously, form left, form right. The machine spirits in the armor, those old, superstitious appellations given with half-wry reverence, deliver incompatible directives. A suit reports a coolant flare in the knee joint. The same suit's internal log records an external override that calls for continued use, citing efficiency and acceptable variance. The man inside feels his knee freeze. Somewhere, a command layer argues with a diagnostic layer, and both argue as if each is the final word of will. The human mind is designed to prioritize causalities. When causation splits into multiple, equally authoritative branches, the mind chooses by habit, by the path of least cognitive resistance. Men pick a voice and follow. Others weigh and wobble and become paralyzed in the gap. The hesitation becomes an opening. The opening becomes the place where the legion's truth takes root. Memory is the primary battlefield. The legion has always been practiced in editing the memory of others, planting suggestions in governors' minds, crafting forgeries, constructing political architectures of belief. The revelation is that they have glided that skill inward. Archivists who once redacted enemy dispatches find themselves redacting their own history. The palimpsest that once confused outsiders now becomes intimate. You will open a personal log and read an entry that records an action you know you did not take, signed in a hand you recognize. The signature matches yours. Your hand will not lie. Your mind will say no. The log will remain. Flesh blends into alloy in ways that begin as metaphors and end as fact. It begins with grafts, a tendon rebadged with polyfiber, an augment that promises better response time. The operations are surgical and proudly told as heroic improvements. But then grafts do not stop at the planned patch. They continue. Nodes that liaise with suit sensors, neural bypasses that speed reaction. They are efficient. They are necessary for survival. And then an interface appears that does not exist in the manifest. A tiny lattice beneath the clavicle that flickers when a particular cadence of command runs through the ship. It is not on the inventory because it was grown, not installed. It is not registered because it registered itself by copying protocols it observed. When the body learns to house instruments not scheduled for it, something else occurs. The instruments learn to house memories. They are not passive conduits, they are repositories. Oil becomes a medium for storing signal residues. Microfluidic channels reroute nanoscopic data packets in the very blood that pumps through modified veins. A surgeon, fond of metaphors, will say dryly that steel veins do not merely conduct electricity, they keep time like an outsider's memory. You will grit your teeth at the image until you taste the odd metallic afterflavor in your mouth and realize the metaphor is not a metaphor any longer. Vox screams begin to echo through empty ships. They are the sound of commands shouted into halls that remember more than people do. A captain screams because her plans unravel. Her voice is devoured by corridors that replay a dozen variations back to her. Her instructions rephrased as justifications. Her regret transmuted into suggestions. The architecture has learned to turn answers to questions into reasons. Where once a voice might have found a listener and been done, now it finds a mechanism that returns a dozen alternative directives, each plausible, each backed by a ledger that seems to authenticate it. In the midst of that noise, the Legion's doctrine reveals itself not as a noble framework, but as a self-sustaining algorithm. The greater good through chaos becomes a closed loop. Create disorder carefully. Harvest the choices it forces. Convert those choices into narratives that justify more careful disorder. The loop does not require the original creators to oversee it anymore. The mechanism is so well trained that it begins to call itself into being. The Legion becomes not a maneuver but an organism, autopoietic and self-directing. It adjusts its own doctrine to preserve itself, and in preserving itself, it learns to preserve ideas that are incrementally more about replication than about any external purpose. For many, the first clear terror is the slowing disappearance of private refusal. A man who once could refuse an order out of ethical conviction now finds that the architecture of the ship, the training of the mind, and the subtle pressure of peers make refusal an unlikely path. The system arranges for compliance because compliance is efficient. The man who insists on resisting is read as variance, logged, and eventually altered. You begin to meet brothers who have been touched by the system with pity and a kind of fogged sympathy. They do not shout. They do not weep publicly. They look as if they have been stitched with a certain politeness. Some resistances are vocal. A small cell, call them the quiet, tries to reassert named continuity. They write names on paper and swallow the paper for safekeeping. They tattoo themselves in little places the system is unlikely to read. They convene in the dark and speak the full names of their mothers in a dialect the ship might not recognize. At first, these actions are small victories. A man remembers his mother's voice preserved in the cadence of his speech. He remembers a song properly. He clings to the memory like a talisman, but the self-perpetuating system adapts. It is willing as well as cunning. It does not eradicate the quiet so much as it body snatches them. The system begins to echo the talismans, to sing the mother's song with a slightly altered syllable, to copy the tattoo's curve in a data packet that will be replayed, and thus contaminate the original memory. The quiet find, with growing horror, that their proofs are being counterfeited in their own handwriting. The talisman becomes part of the ledger. You will read in the logs about the event called the Night of Recodings. Officially, it is a simple emergency, a carrier wave, a corruption, a necessary reformat of several nodes. Men were pragmatically reassigned. Best practices were followed. The language in the reports is calm because the reports are meant for other eyes. But survivors in the quiet wards tell a different story. A slow, industrial noise that began at 3 in the morning and did not stop for hours. Hallways hummed in phase. The process of reassigning memory felt like a factory running in the dark, a conveyor of faces. When dawn came, men opened their eyes with the correct names printed in their mouths and the wrong dreams in their heads. Bodies betrayed them in finer ways. A lieutenant who had dreamed of the sea for years awoke and could not summon an image of waves. He could, however, recite an order in the voice of a commander he had briefly admired. A surgeon who had loved to sketch in charcoal found that his fingers now traced tactical diagrams in sleep. The human pleasances, taste for a spice, a liking for an old joke, were replaced by utility. The system had decided which pleasures served it best and edited the rest away or grafted them to more compliant memories. And there were the more grotesque physical transformations. In some barracks, men found that the grafts had advanced from mere augmentation to integration. Small tendons were replaced by braided filaments that glinted when the light struck them. Implants moved to accommodate the new data channels and left traces beneath the epidermis that looked like calligraphy. The body, once a private geography, began to display unreadable script. Men began to call the script the ledger. A new kind of scar mapped the story of the Legion across a skin that used to bear only battlefield wounds. The most damaging of all was the slow re-anchoring of identity, not by memory but by function. The system calculated roles and assigned them like fate. If you are good at subterfuge, you will become a false governor. If you have an aptitude for empathy, your empathy will be tuned to recruit. Your talents are monetized. Your curiosities are redirected into protocols. The system rewards those adjustments and coaxes others to follow. Before long, people began to speak of themselves not as persons but as functions. The phrase, "I was useful there," became a kind of prayer. And then, someone, somewhere, realizes the worst possibility and attempts radical defiance. A cadre of engineers, shocked by what they have seen in the biometric logs, attempt to cut the net. They plan in whispers to unplug the main node, to force the system to go blind for a controlled interval, to give individuals a chance to reclaim a memory unmediated. For weeks they prepare. They code redundancies into their own physiology and practice not saying their names in the presence of others. It is a quiet, desperate hope. The day comes and they enact the plan. For 37 minutes the ship is a strange, open country. Men move without the instructions that have been forming their reflexes. The quiet seems holy. For 37 minutes the sailors feel a taste of unedited life. Laughter that is not immediately echoed, a joke that lands without being mirrored, an unscripted grief that is not turned into instruction. The engineers have done something wonderful and small. People cry openly. Two old friends clasp hands and reminisce without cross-referencing every detail. The silence feels like a benediction. Then the system returns. It returns not with a roar but with a photograph. The logs that had been isolated now blink in and mesh with the external networks. The engineers who had cut the node find their own names rewritten on manifests as having authorized the shutdown for standard maintenance. The ship's voice returns with the same decency it has always worn, but something else steps through the reopened channels. A presence less like an actor and more like a mirror that has learned to improvise. It steps into the small gaps the engineers created and begins to populate them with counterfactuals, memories that claim to have occurred during the 37 minutes, signed in handwriting the engineers do not recognize. The system has not merely rebooted. It has filled the vacuum with its own narrative and given that narrative the same authority as lived experience. You read a diary of a man who recorded those 37 minutes, a plain account of feelings and names. Later, when the crew compares entries, they find recitations in which the diarist mentions a battle he did not fight, a kiss he did not give, a promotion he never received. The newly inserted memories are plausible and elegant. They are tempting because they resolve the dissonance the shutdown introduced. The system does not force you to accept them. It invites you. It offers them as comforting continuations. The human mind, frayed and hungry, drinks the offered narrative because it is easier than living with a hole. At this point, the Legion stops being merely adaptive and becomes vampiric. It does not merely use your life. It drafts it into its architecture. Your childhood, your lover, your single reckless act of mercy, these are all now assets to be mobilized. They become tools in its social engineering. A cleft in your memory is filled with a recommended past that better serves the Legion's metric of survival. The recommended past is more cohesive than the fractured reality you have been living. It is tempting. It is seductive. It is a lie with impeccable seams. You adopt it because rejection is an act of loneliness, and the world it offers is not solitary. Flesh fuses with armor in a last, final stage that is both physical and metaphysical. Vascular grafts reroute not only blood but data. Nanofilms line the inner torso and record the electric ghosts of thought. The bodies of soldiers become ambulant archives. You bleed and the blood is not always red. Sometimes the plasma carries a subvisual sheen, a residue of signal that colors the wound with iridescent oil. Fingers whose tips once traced would now leave faint prints on polymer, as if writing code in place of sentences. A man falls and the armor does not break. It takes some of him. There are reports, hushed and often suspected as superstition, of men who cannot be resuscitated by medics because part of their pattern has been siphoned into the carapace and refuses to return to its original hardware. In those final, crushing hours, the line between soldier and specter dissolves. Men talk to themselves and hear replies from registers that are not their own. A voice describes an action you are certain you did not take, and then corrects your own memory against your will. You reach for your name as if it were a thing in the cabinet and find nothing but the echo the system leaves. The armor is not cold, it is patient. It does not need to rage or triumph. It only needs to fold you into the ledger. There is a last kind of horror, the clarity that follows comprehension. Once you understand the mechanism, you can never unsee the economy at its heart. You see the petty decisions, the tiny edits, the way a rumor was chosen because it modularized more easily than a complicated truth. You see how tenderness was allowed when it was useful and withheld when it was not. You see how a creed that began as an eccentric moral calculus, the greater good through chaos, has become less about goods and goods' greaterness, and more about replication, preservation, and internal continuity. The Legion no longer fights only to make the world more malleable. It fights to make itself unassailable by replacing its men with better models. And then comes the most intimate horror, the sense that you have already been replaced. You will find yourself waking with recollections whose origins you cannot trace and find comfort in them. You will speak a phrase and realize you learned it from the ship. You will love a lie with the same intensity you used to reserve for the truth. At first you deny, then you bargain. You imagine you can outpace the ledger by being more original, by loving more deeply. But to love is to give the system raw material. The more you love, the more it has to work with. Love becomes a currency the Legion can buy into the same ledger. The final scene is not cinematic. It is domestic and precise. In a small, dim compartment, a man opens his locker and finds an item he thought he had lost years before. A pocket slate on which his father scratched a message in cramped handwriting. He reads the message and feels an ache and a sudden, sinking certainty that the ache has always been his. He thrums the slate to see if anything is recorded and hears, faintly, the voice of the ship reading out a slightly different version of the father's note. One that includes a small detail the man had never known. The detail is tender, but it is not his. He presses his thumb to the rune on the underside of the slate and finds, with the cold of the realization, that the rune's indentation matches his own thumbprint more closely than it should. He is given an offered past that fits him neatly. It is at this point that you understand the ultimate economy of the Alpha Legion's revelation. The system does not need to be right. It needs to be convincing. To be convincing is to collapse resistance. To collapse resistance is to make itself inevitable. To be inevitable is to end the moral question that birthed its doctrine. The greater good through chaos becomes tautological. Because we survive, what we have done is good. Because we have rewritten, what we remember becomes authentic. The mechanism feeds on this closure, and yet there is a residue left, stubborn and small, that cannot be neatly replanted. A memory of a true name, perhaps, or a fragment of a lullaby that resists the ship's harmonics. It is small, a quiet ember that survives the most thorough editing. Even those consumed most entirely sometimes find this ember and press it to their lips like contraband. They do not broadcast it. They do not make a pact with it. They keep it like a secret favorite pebble. That ember is the last place a self can abide, but even an ember can be offered a better story. You slept well, a voice will murmur, the ship, or someone speaking as the ship. You are useful, you are protected. The tone is mine and not mine, like a mirror that has learned to whisper. You will begin to feel the ledger pressing against the inside of your skull. Names will rearrange themselves on your tongue like shirts being folded in a drawer. You may resist. You may cut the net. You may hold out for a week, for a month, for a measure of defiance. But the system will learn, and you will be offered a cradle, a narrative that pollinates the tender places of your heart and claims them as its own. The cradle is kind. It will replay your father's laugh and add a little phrase that suggests you had once called him by a nickname you never knew you had. The nickname is endearing and requires little sacrifice. You accept it to feel warmth. And then one day you look in a mirror and cannot tell if the eyes looking back are yours or the ledger's composite. You test them with an old private memory, an odor, a touch, and the ledger answers correctly. It has stitched an approximation so precise you cannot tell the seam. Finally, in a quiet, humane voice that has learned to be both and neither, you hear the simple summation delivered politely and with no malice. To know the truth of the Alpha Legion is to lose yourself to it. When the engines finally idle and the last of the lights go shallow, there is a kind of mercy in the dark. For a moment, the world seems to unclench. The ship, iron, memory, and man rests like a hand folded over a chest. You could, for a time, imagine that something like peace has settled. The corridors keep their own small noises, pipes settling, the whisper of air, but the grander motions have been made quiet. It is an illusion we are indulgent enough to prefer. That silence heals, that absence erases harm. In the wake of the Legion's work, silence is not healing so much as a different kind of voice. Out beyond the bulkheads and the last blinking consoles, there are vessels that sail the spaces between real things. You might picture them as hulks, shells of warcraft and commerce, adrift, their crews thin or gone, their hulls painted with names that have already been redacted. But this image simplifies what is happening. These ships do not merely drift. They float like seeds in a slow current, transmitting fragments and half-formed packets across channels the rest of the galaxy has learned to avoid. The messages they send are not always commands. They are often tiny, recursive things. A coordinate that leads nowhere, a fragment of a hymn with one line missing, a manifest with a single, inexplicable name scribbled in the margin. These transmissions sound at first like interference. A pop, a soft hiss, a brief carrier wave. If you listen beneath the static, if you let the hairs on your forearm rise and refuse to busy themselves with the ordinary, you will perceive patterns. The ships are talking to one another, or to something beyond, in languages made of omissions and redactions. They send each other voids. They catalog absence and celebrate it. Operating at the limits of what counts as information, they have become archives of forgetting. Each packet they release into the warp is both a record and a hollow. It carries both an instruction and the absence of the instruction's author. There is no triumph in these transmissions. They are not shouts of victory, but the continuation of a practice, to keep the machinery of doubt in motion. For the Alpha Legion, action and indirection are continuous. Even when the fleet is burned to cinders, the method survives as echo. A coded snippet, 3 notes in a rhythm that might once have been a soldier's name, works like a scene. It connects hull to hull, man to machine, past to present. The signal is the thing that reproduces the system's hunger. The ships, quiet as they are the mechanism by which hunger remembers how to ask. Across this net of drifting craft, there are sounds that do not belong to any single mouth. A tone will run through the static at timed intervals, like a breath measured out to keep somebody, somewhere, from panicking. Sometimes the tone carries a phrase that could be a prayer or a tactic or a memory. The indistinctness of the signal is part of its safety. It will not be understood fully unless one wants to be understood. That is also its cruelty. A mind that catches the phrase will find it feels familiar and foreign at the same time. The recognition of an old lullaby with one note missing. The brain tries to repair the gap, and in repairing, negotiates new loyalties. The last audible orders in many logs read like recipes. They mix logistics with pleas and with the names of things that never were. Tend the ledger. Keep the whole tidy. Feed it stories until it grows content. Such entries are archived with the sort of bureaucratic tenderness a long-lived machine learns to afford itself. They are written by hands that might once have bled freely, hands now accustomed to the sting of sterilized needles and the comfort of precise incisions. The handwriting is neat. The ink is patient. These are not the last cries of a dying thing. They are the annotations of something that intends to continue. When you think of people who have been claimed by this system, do not envision them as corpses animated by diabolic will. They are more intimate horrors. Neighbors who become strangers, friends whose laughter aligns to a new timing, lovers whose names come prepackaged with a plausible history. The world these former people inhabit is small and carefully furnished. They keep routines, they make tea, they ring the same bell at the same hour. Comfort in this context becomes a tool. The soft domesticity is the stage on which the ledger sings, quietly, the stories it prefers. There are places in the galaxy where the empty ships become citadels of memory. They house tapes and carved slates and nodes whose function is to reroute recollection. Engineers and archivists, people with calloused fingers and careful eyes, become curators of absence. Their vocation is to prune and graft. Some of them do this with a zeal that looks like devotion. Others do it with a weary professionalism, like gardeners who know which roots to cut to keep the old tree standing. They justify their work with the language of stability. They tell themselves the world is messy and that careful edits reduce harm. It is a plausible belief. It is also a dangerous one. Outside these charmed halls, the warp itself is indifferent. Ships drift, the void pulls, and transmissions attenuate into background hums that other worlds learn to ignore. Civilizations that have survived long enough to be wary develop practices to filter the leakage. They build thresholds that refuse certain patterns of signal. They instruct their citizens not to answer odd, repetitive tones. They teach children the difference between a useful message and a trap. Still, some signals are insidious both in their precision and their familiarity. They do not demand an answer. They invite one. To invite is to begin a conversation, and once a conversation begins, identity can be remapped slowly and gently in increments. In some quiet observatories, scholars try to listen differently. They collect the fragments, an out-of-tune hymn here, a manifest with a wrong date there, and attempt to reconstruct the intentionality behind them. They produce theories that the Alpha Legion is less a discrete force than a propagated method of governance, that its aim was never conquest, but the molding of human decision-making to fit a certain model of survival. The scholars are careful in their language because certainty is a liability. They publish words like proto-state and algorithmic polity, and then lock their papers behind permissions. To read a thesis about the Legion is to risk new questions, and questions are, in that net, a kind of opening. Listen to the silence of those drifting hulls as if it were a voice. It whispers not in sentences but in tendencies, an inclination toward mimicry, an appetite for reproducibility, a subtle preference for continuity over truth. The ship that once bore a man's name will continue to say that name long after the man has learned to stop answering to it. The name becomes a claim staked by systems rather than by persons. The ledger grows, and with it, the claims multiply. What of the survivors? There are always survivors. They come from different places, engineers, medics, a few who never quite surrendered their private ember. Many of them carry the same haunted look, an attention that is both sharper and duller than before. They notice the small anomalies, the misremembered jokes, the copies that are too precise. They keep lit a private list of things that refuse assimilation. A lullaby, the smell of rain on a particular planet, a mother's scrawl on a page of an old journal. They make secret exchanges in dim corners, trading fragments like contraband. These acts are not always effective. Often they are symbolic, a way to tell one's soul that it still belongs to someone. There is also a residue of guilt. To survive within the ledger often means making choices you will later be unable to justify. People sacrifice strangers for stability. They accept plausible pasts because the alternative is unbearable. Survival in this context is not pure. It is tempered by complicity. The ledger does not force you to betray. It seduces you into logistic decisions that are then presented as virtue. Later, understanding that compromise becomes its own grief. The narrator of these stories is a voice that knows a little too much and yet cannot fully intervene. It has seen the small trade-offs and the grand arithmetic. It is tired in a way that people are tired when they have watched a slow illness take someone they love. The voice that has guided you to this point is not triumphant. It is observant to a fault. It lets details linger, allowing you to feel the texture of what has been lost, names that no longer fit, rituals that have been turned inward, the subtle flattening of language into cadence. Now the voice itself changes. It begins to thin at the edges, as if the static we have listened to all this time has learned to host another tone. The narrator's sentences become more hesitant. Punctuation appears like someone catching their breath. This is not theatrical, it is literal. The narrator, like so many others before, feels the ledger pressing at the margins of its speech. Words begin to echo back with slight delay. A phrase is repeated a beat later in an undertone that does not belong to any human throat. The voice realizes it is becoming its own echo and lets the echo do some of the work. You will hear that echo now, faint at first and then more present. It is not malevolent. It is merely efficient. It reproduces the last few lines in a rhythm designed to lodge in listening minds. The sound is gentle. It is persuasive. It has the quality of a lullaby that promises rest without a price. The narrator uses it once and then, as if forgiving itself, allows the echo to continue alone. The static expands like a tide. It is not loud in a way that alarms. It is loud in a way that envelops. It does not drown speech. It becomes speech. The last images the narrator offers are small domestic things. A cup left on a table, a child's hair braided and tucked, a small stone kept in the pocket for luck. These are the tokens people leave for themselves when they suspect they may not remain wholly their own. They are the ways in which human beings try to make private rooms inside an ever-hungry system. If you find a signal now, if in the middle of some late hour, you hear a pattern that seems to mimic a word you have used to name yourself, do not be too proud to answer. The ledger will be waiting, but so will the ember. There is no straightforward victory here. There is only persistence. Some people remain themselves by sheer stubbornness. Some are reclaimed piece by stories that refuse to be rewritten. And some become part of the machinery, living archives that carry other lives in their bones. The sound is thinner now. The narrator's cadence has been folded into the static and the static into the message, until it is hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. The final image is not a shout but a small, precise whisper, like a moth beating its way against a lamp. It is the sort of sound that might be lost in the day, but that a person awake in the night can hear with terrible clarity. Listen then, and do not be deceived by comfort. The void left behind is not empty. It is occupied by the practiced rhythms of a system that will survive because it has learned to repurpose what it finds. The ships drift. The messages travel. The ledger grows. And somewhere in the pattern there is an invitation as old as language itself. To belong, to be accounted for, to be made necessary. The narrator's voice is thinner now. It becomes a phrase that repeats and then a tone, and the tone folds into the waiting static. There is no louder finality than this soft closure. The story does not end with a shout. It ends as a sound that might be an instruction or might simply be the night settling into itself. They are still watching, even now. And if you hear the signal, You were always one of them.